Well, I've always been interested in politics, and even from a very early age followed politics quite closely. And I recognized that the apartheid government and the apartheid system was fundamentally wrong, and the only way it could be fixed was by having a new constitution for South Africa. So when I started working for the then Progressive Federal Party, I worked with Dr. Van Zyl Slabbert, who developed the constitutional policy for the PFP, which included many of the elements that are now currently included in the South African Constitution. So it has been for many years, 30 years or more. Well, in 1994, I was very fortunate to be elected as one of the DP's 10 members of Parliament, and members of the National Assembly and senators were members of what was known as the Constitutional Assembly. And so, because we were so small, and because of the principle of inclusivity, we got to sit on every single committee of the constitution-making process, from the Constitutional Assembly itself, to the Constitutional Committee, to the theme committees, and to the various drafting committees that were set up over time. So our contribution to the drafting of the final constitution was quite disproportionate to our actual size, and also the degree to which our ideas prevailed was extraordinary given the size of our team that was involved in the constitution-making process.
Okay, thank you.
It was lots of hard work, and there were occasions where we literally would be sitting until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, hammering out clauses of the Constitution, trying to get the maximum degree of our policy adopted as part of the final text. But I guess there were some funny times too. For example, on one occasion when we were up until probably the early hours of the morning, but had had a couple of drinks, and the conversation in the drafting committee got a little raucous, tempers got a bit frayed, and to this day I think there are some people who remember that occasion with a degree of amusement and exasperation. It's certainly one of the things that I remember about Pravin Gordhan, because he was chairing that particular session, that he had to remain unruffled and calm despite the fact that tempers were getting a little out of control. There are 6 or 7 words in the South African Constitution that I can point to and say, I wrote that bit into the South African Constitution. Now, there are very, very few people anywhere in the world who can say that they actually not only participated in making their country's constitution, but that there are actually words in the Constitution that they themselves wrote. I mean, in America they talk about the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution. Well, I don't know whether we would use the same sexist language, but I'm certainly very proud to have been part of the founding people who wrote the South African Constitution. No, obviously not. The Constitution of South Africa is a compromise document. Some people got more of it than they expected. Some people got less of it than they expected. But if you look at the Constitution as a whole, you will see that just about every one of the participating parties got significant portions of their political platform included. For us, I think the really important sections relate to the power of the provinces, to the Bill of Rights, to the control over the security forces, to the administration of justice. But if you look in the South African Constitution, you will also see that the right to self-determination is guaranteed. So the Freedom Front Plus got a little bit of what they wanted. You will see that there is provision made in the Constitution for a degree of asymmetry. So you'll see that the IFP got something that they wanted. So I think, seen as a whole, it really was a document that sought to include everybody's political ideas in a way that made South Africa a really wonderfully inclusive society in which to live. Well, that's a difficult question to answer, because on several occasions, yes, one got overwhelmed by what we were doing. But on the other hand, you were frankly so busy and sometimes so overwhelmed by the sheer volume of work that the enormity of what one was doing, I think, did not really sink in. But I remember one occasion, the night before the final adoption of the final constitution, and that our team, the 10 of us, met in a room in the old assembly building to decide whether or not we should support the constitution. And the debate went on for some considerable time, because there were some people who felt that because the constitution didn't encapsulate exactly what we wanted, we should oppose it. There were others who said, this is a compromise document, we have made significant impact on it, we have got much more in it than our numbers actually justify, we should support it. And then I got that feeling that here we are really making history. We are deciding on the new future for our country as a democracy. And I think it was on that occasion that it really sunk into me quite how historic that moment was. Well, I don't think there is an imbalance. What one needs to do is to achieve a balance, and I don't think we've got that entirely correct. Under apartheid, the prisons were really ghastly places. People were detained without trial, people were tortured, people were not allowed to make contact with their families, their doctors, their attorneys, and a great deal of mischief occurred during that time, an abuse of human rights. We, in the Constitution and in subsequent legislation that was passed, make provision for a detention system that is open and transparent, in which detained and convicted people have rights. But equally, what we haven't got entirely right is the notion of offenders' rights. The rights of people against whom offences have been committed. And really what we need to do now is we need to work on things like victims' charters. We need to look at the whole concept of a fund for the victims of crime. These are all contained in DA policy, and in our criminal justice policy, a very important section is the section that deals with prisons work where prisoners work. We want to put prisoners to work, and prisoners should then earn money, some of which should be paid into a fund to compensate the people they wronged when they committed the crime. So I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. It hasn't been done yet. The balance isn't perfect, but it's a whole lot better than it was during the apartheid regime. Well, third generation rights are, as you say, not justiciable in the ordinary sense of the word. But we are seeing now the beginnings of a body of jurisprudence that deals with achieving those rights. And if you look at the litigation that is currently being fought through the courts on the right to basic education, I think you are starting to find a increasing acceptance of the fact that these are important rights, and while the attainment of those rights might be progressive and constrained by the amount of resources, there is an increasing view by the courts that you cannot do nothing about those rights. And I think it will be very interesting to find out over time whether the courts increasingly hold the view that it is insufficient for the government simply to say that they are constrained by resources, that they are constrained by other factors, and that they have an obligation to provide those rights in real terms for real people. Well, I think that what happened in the interim constitution is that it was a document written by lawyers for lawyers. And accordingly, every I was dotted and every T was crossed and every contingency was considered except success. And really what we tried to do in the final constitution is to make the document accessible to the person in the street. And in the process, some of the legal technicalities disappeared and some of the meaning emerged. So I think if you read the equality clause in the final constitution as a person in the street, you have an idea about what was intended and what equality should mean for you as a person in the street, rather than as a lawyer in a court. So frankly, I support the format of the Constitution and the more accessible language in which it is written. Well, the danger about changing the Constitution or amending or reviewing the Constitution is that it is a very delicate compromise. And if you start to tinker with the Constitution, you start to affect that compromise. So in broad principle, the Democratic Alliance does not support constitutional amendments except when these are absolutely necessary for the proper functioning of the Constitution. We do in the Constitution create a constitutional court. One of the roles of the constitutional court is to broaden the jurisprudence that was intended by the Constitution. And really, if there is a role for the constitutional court, it is to take the Constitution to identify where there are gaps, where there are ambiguities, and to then flesh out the Constitution. So, for example, there have been a number of actions that were taken to the Constitutional Court relating to the right to vote, including the right of prisoners to vote, the right of South Africans living abroad to vote. Those do not have to be written into the Constitution. It is entirely appropriate that the Constitutional Court should take the original document, the Constitution, and say, what did the founding persons intend when they wrote this Constitution in relation to practical situations that have arisen? It is far better to go down that route than to amend the Constitution just because there's a gap here or a gap there. No, I don't think the Constitution should be improved. I really do believe that it is as good as we could have possibly hoped it to be, and although there have been some amendments to the Constitution over time, those have really been on the margins and have not dealt with the really central issues in our Constitution.